So when you're looking at this and considering the mining sector itself, what role does mining equipment play in this?
Yeah, that's one of the factors, like sort of the second one after the security budget that I looked into, like, how many mining rigs are we even going to need to pull this off? Is it just times 4 based on the number that's there today? How many are there today?
But they will get more efficient, though.
That's the assumption, and that is betting on human ingenuity, which in general, like if you look at the history of of mining rigs, that's been true. They have been improving a lot.
Is there? I don't know if it's in your report, but have you tracked the performance of the miners through their innovation cycles?
Yeah.
Okay, can we see that?
Yeah, I think if you go into the slides, Danny, there's the report is underneath.
When I went to the Texas Blockchain Council's event in Austin, I think, was it last month, Danny?
No, a couple of months ago.
A couple of months ago. There was a guy there who had created a museum of ASICs.
Yeah.
And he had them literally from the start through. It was fascinating to see.
So this one shows the different miner models, the most efficient model every year that was released.
Yeah.
How much power did they need? What was their hash rate per second? So this kind of shows the progression. That sort of the equalization is the watts per terahash thing. That shows the efficiency. So how many watts do you need to calculate 1 trillion hashes per second? So the most recent sort of best performing models, Antminer S19 XP Hydro, the bottom there, it has it takes about 21 watts to calculate 1 trillion hashes per second. Do you see the improvement there in the column next to it? So that's how much more efficient they are getting. So if you look at this past year, actually that's been the lowest jump.
Yeah, 3%.
So only 3%. So in some of the further modeling that I did, I tried to assume that worst case scenario. What if we only get 3% more efficient every year? Because there, a lot of people have talked about Moore's law and how eventually it becomes really difficult to get these machines more efficient.
Yeah, but you know why? They're saving the super efficient machine for 2024.
Yeah.
They know what they're going to do. Did you hear that thesis? I think it was John Carvalho put out that people are still mining in China.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
China banned mining as a way to radically redistribute all the old inefficient miners around the world, which saw massive mining warehouses created in the US. And come 2024, once the new range of miners, new efficient miners become available, they will be in China, and the US will be left with these less efficient machines.
Yeah.
What did you buy anything into that? It'd be fascinating if it's true.
Yeah, I kind of I have my doubts that that's kind of the level they're thinking at. Let's distribute all of this stuff and then just screw a lot of people over outside of China, because they would also, I think they would realize, if all of the hash rate would then go back to China, in a couple of years from now, and that's where the most efficient machines would be, then maybe a lot of people would lose faith in Bitcoin as a result. If they would feel like, oh, China's just taking this thing over, because that's the narrative that would probably be
how many
spun.
things have we had that should lead to us losing our faith? All the shit this year, we should have lost our faith.
No, for sure. But I think more in terms of additional investors, not the people who are in there, because they're going to stick around and they'll sort of keep dollar cost averaging in and buy more, but maybe new investors that just don't really understand much about all of this, they might be a bit frightened.
I don't even think they will know it's happening or read
Also
about
true.
it.
Yeah.
I just don't think they'll know. I think it'd be fascinating if it did. I'd kind of laugh at that. It wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah.
Interesting. This is fascinating. Okay, let's talk about the energy side of things. How does energy impact hash rate?
So energy is just ultimately one of the most important things, because it's responsible for a large amount of the costs that miners have. Other than the mining rig part, we're not really diving into that as much. But that's part of the cost. But ultimately, the energy defines the energy price defines whether a miner is going to stick around when the margins are really small.
Okay.
So what I tried to look into is what are some of the different scenarios, like how much energy will Bitcoin mining use in general over the next 20 years in this case? If we want to reach a zettahash, what does that look like? Is it going to boil the oceans? Is it going to use up orders of magnitude more energy or not? So what I took in this case was the hash rate growth, sort of the average growth per mining rig that is out there. How much more hashes is it doing per second? So on the one hand, you have mining rigs getting more efficient. On the other hand, the newer models that are coming out, they also have higher hash rates than the previous models that were out there. And if you do some of the math on there, then on average, the mining rig is getting about 3.6% more hashes per second every year. So if you take that kind of growth and you map it out, then over the next 20 years, you see the hash rate growth grow to about the zettahash range there. So that's sort of the 2/3 of the graph.
Yeah.
And then what if mining rigs don't become more efficient than they are today? That's when you get that first scenario that Danny was just showing, where the power demand would just grow along with the hash rate. Like it's just going to be the same. The only thing that happens is people just put more, like 3% more miners online every year on average. And like the mining rigs just get a little more power in there, but it just doesn't really change.
By the way, in this, do you account for old rigs going offline?
Yeah, exactly. So
Yeah.
the sort of the assumption here is that the average ASIC has about a 5-year lifespan. Is what typically gets talked about. That can be inaccurate. It could be that we find that in 10 years from now, actually this time frame becomes a bit bigger or it's a bit smaller. But you can model this out the same all over again if you use a 3-year time frame, if you use a 10-year time frame. But for now, I've taken 5 years, and then you assume that 20% of the hash rate or sort of 20% of the mining rigs, not the hash rate, will go offline every year and get replaced by a newer generation. So that's a pretty aggressive replacement rate to take, because that just means, that's tons of machines all around the world that are being replaced every year. But if we take the 3% yearly efficiency improvement that you saw earlier from the 2021 best model to the 2022 one, if we take that kind of improvement every year, then you would see that in terms of power demand, it actually requires significantly less power just purely from this compounding efficiency improvement every year. So we're already talking like instead of taking like 50 gigawatts, you're like down to 30 or so, which is already quite a big difference. And then there's another scenario where if we take the average over the past 5 years of how much more efficient mining rigs have gotten, because that last year, the 3%, that was a bit of an anomaly. The previous years, there was always like a 30 or 40% jump. So if you take that kind of number, then you would actually decrease in total power demand compared to where we are today, just because the rate of innovation is so crazy high. But as mentioned before, like it's not necessarily realistic to expect that every year mining rigs will keep getting 30 or 40% more efficient than the year before, and then about 20% of all the mining rigs gets replaced. But that is what it would look like if that was the case.
So the price of energy is super important.
So it's extremely important because in this case, this talks a bit about the efficiency of mining rigs, and that is one part of the equation. But then energy comes in. Like you can have the most efficient mining rig, but if you don't have access to cheap energy, then you'll still get outcompeted by a lot of people, quite likely. So looking at maybe we can skip a bit ahead at some of the energy graphs. But essentially, I think this is still important to point out, as I forgot the last part there. Even in those worst case scenarios, the percentage that is actually being used of the total global energy demand, if you go one step further, Danny, you see the percentages on there. So even in a very aggressive growth scenario, the total power demand from the Bitcoin network, like worst case here would be 0.15% of the global power demand. That is like at a rate where 20%, we have 20% growth in hash rate every year for the next 20 years, or in this case, this is about 8 years actually, to get to a zettahash. That's how long it would take at that rate. But then, like worst case, we'd end up at 0.15, and that's assuming that there will be no innovation in mining for the next 8 years, which is just not a realistic assumption because that's never been the case in the history of Bitcoin.
That's a really interesting statistic.
Yeah.
And it's great for the fudsters who are worried about Bitcoin's energy consumption.
Yeah.
I mean, it was that crazy thing that came out for you. I'm not sure it was that Cambridge group or somebody that said like Bitcoin will end up using all the energy on the planet.
No, that was the World Economic Forum.
Oh, yeah. Fucking
that was
idiots.
2017, and they predicted that by 2020 it would use all of the energy in the world. So I kind of I just tried to figure this out myself. Like, okay, how much is it actually going to use? And these are sort of the numbers that I arrived at. But these are just scenarios. It could be that the actual growth rate is significantly higher. Mm-hmm. And some people might say, like, well, if you look at the past year, we've gone from like 200 exahash to like almost 300 in a year. That's a 50% increase. So people start taking that kind of number. But at the same time, it's good for people to realize this has been very much an anomaly. I think Troy Cross also mentioned this quite a bit, where he was saying like this was a time period where mining was insanely profitable. So people were buying rigs like crazy, and just everything came online over a pretty brief period of time. So yeah, that's important to look into. And this is also something I try to highlight in the report is like, even if the energy increases so much, then the next piece of FUD, I guess, that a lot of people have is, but that's all going to be more coal-based energy that is being used for Bitcoin mining, etc. And we have energy crises in like that's sort of starting to blow over a little bit in some parts now. But what if there are energy crises? Like how is it going to impact households and whatnot? But actually, if you look at where Bitcoin miners operate, I made this graph here of on the one axis, you have the sort of energy scarcity versus abundance. So how much energy is there around in areas? And on the other axis, you have the population. So is it densely populated or sparsely populated? And if you use these two axes, you get 4 quadrants. And typically what you see is that miners do not operate in the areas where a lot of people are worried about them operating. They don't operate in industrial areas where the energy is being used up by consumers anyway. They don't operate as much in cities in general, because typically that's just where there is lots of demand, even though cities, they need to over-generate their demand. And it's been talked about on a lot of shows, I think. But they're very much in like rural areas where there's a lot of renewable energy that cannot be like instantly transported to where the people actually live. So that's where miners operate. That's where they get the cheapest possible energy. And this is also where you get into some of the discussion around the vented methane gas, because that is actually like, and I would expect in the future, is going to be a far more popular source of energy, because in essence, you could even envision a future where governments would almost subsidize miners to go set this stuff up. If they had an adequate understanding of how mining can play a role there, then they might say like, hold on, we need to go all in on this and actually find entrepreneurs who are willing to put this in as many places as possible to get rid of all that methane gas and to stop warming the planet.
Isn't it ironic that this industry, which a number of environmentalists have accused it of being damaging for the environment, especially the Greenpeace. Is Greenpeace that changed the code?
Yeah.
Yeah, those dicks.
And Ripple.
Yeah, and Ripple. Is actually something that might contribute to dealing with some of the environmental issues that we have. And we can realistically get to a point where it's energy usage is actually negative in terms of
carbon negative.
Yeah, sorry, it's carbon negative. I mean, it's ironic that we can get to that point with this technology.
Yeah, and it feels like such a tragedy realizing this, and then just thinking like, how can we get these people to understand it? And one of the goals of the report, I sort of tried to write it in a way where almost everyone can take something away from it, and it becomes a bit of a tool to start conversations. And I also use it very much to highlight some of the work that, for example, Sean Connell with Lancium that they're doing, Adam Wright, who's also been on the show, Daniel Batten's work is like quite prominent in it as well, because he talks a lot about the modeling around this, like how can we get it carbon negative? So it's just it's sort of a way to market it, like the packages in such a way to get people interested and to see like what is the future of mining going to look like and how can these things play a role.
But it's insane. It's like it can become carbon negative while fixing the financial system. Satoshi, you crazy bastard.
Overachiever.
I mean, none of us know who Satoshi is, but if that person is still alive, I would love to know what they make of this, because either they're going to go, I fucking knew this was going to happen. That's how badass I was. Or they're going to be like, I had no fucking idea. I just created this. I just wanted to create a tool for people to sell.
This sounds like a story at a pub somewhere, where